As we inch closer and closer to the 2022 midterms, how crazy is that? The pressure is on for election officials in states all across the country to make sure that the vote is fairly counted and accurately counted, especially given the unprecedented assault on elections and election workers since the 2020 campaign by the Trump right. However, the job responsibilities have drastically changed. Politico spoke with 10 top election officials and found that they see their jobs not just as election overseers, but as full-time mythbusters on the front lines of defending democracy itself, fighting against the conspiracy theories and misinformation from those who promote the big lie and sow distrust. These high stakes come at a time when faith in the country's election systems reaches critical levels. A recent NPR Ipsos poll found that 64% of Americans believe that democracy was in crisis and at risk of failing. Joining us now is Arizona Secretary of State Katie Hobbs, who's also now running for governor there. Kim Atkins-Storr is still with us. Madam Secretary, we've been talking to you since it all started, since the days after the 2020 election. What has changed? What has gotten better? What has gotten worse?
Well, I think we've gotten certainly better at responding to the misinformation, but I still see it as one of the biggest threats to our democracy. We are working in coordination with secretaries of state across the country on the Trusted Info campaign to ensure that folks are getting their election-related information from trusted sources. But as you're well aware, a lot of the misinformation actually targets those trusted sources and tells people not to trust them. So it is really a constant battle. It's increasingly difficult to combat.
Madam Secretary, the idea that the people, the purveyors of disinformation are running to have jobs like yours really feels like the scariest escalation from the big lie adherents. What would happen? What would have happened in Arizona if a big lie adherent had been in charge of Arizona's elections?
Well, I think one of the safeguards that we have is that there's several safeguards. Elections are highly decentralized, and so they're administered largely at the local level, not the state level, certainly not the national level. But also we have checks and balances on the process. Counties certify the canvass results. The state certifies the compiled results, and that involves not just one elected official, but myself, the governor, the attorney general. So there's checks and balances. And what we're at risk of losing is some of those checks and balances. I mean, we have an actual insurrectionist running for Secretary of State here in Arizona who has said if he was Secretary of State that Trump would still be president, with absolutely no basis for that assertion. But it clarifies how important all of these offices are, and that democracy is on the ballot in 2022 at every level. It's part of why I'm running for governor, to help ensure that we still have those checks and balances. And I hope folks will join me at katiehobbs.org.
Do you feel, we cover all the fervor on the sort of disinformation side on the right? That's where all the heat is in the Republican base. That's why they act as crazy as they do and as loyal to Trump. Is there an equal intensity around the pro-democracy, pro-truth side?
I think there is. I think that folks I talk to certainly are aware of what's at stake in this upcoming election and further down the road, and are certainly continuing to mobilize to fight the misinformation, to fight the attacks from the other side, and to help protect our democracy and the future of fair and free elections in our country.
Kim, we've been talking to Secretary Hobbs, we've been talking to Secretary Benson and others who've been on the front line who have seen the tactics of the sort of election deniers and the Trump base. And I wonder what you make of this sort of wild, wild west of someone ending up in one of these jobs who is not faithful to the rule of law, who is not rooted in the truth or not loyal to the votes of the constituents of their state. It seems like all bets are off if that comes to pass.
It really does. I mean, it seems evidence that those who are purveying the big lie and to do it from outside of the system have realized that it would be a lot easier to do from inside the system. And so you have officials like Secretary Hobbs that don't just have to fight the misinformation coming from outside, but from other people who are becoming in these local and state offices, election officials themselves. And that leads to my question for Secretary Hobbs is, does she have the resources that she needs? I mean, Democrats are asking for additional funding to try to bolster, to give state officials the ability to make sure they have enough polling places, that they are able to have the tools to keep people from being kicked off voting rolls and such, and actually expand access to voting in the way that coronavirus aid was did that in 2020. The money has dried up, but the likelihood of that getting past Republicans in Washington is slim. What do you need to be able to do your job and protect the elections in November?
Well, certainly funding is important, and we have consistently underfunded elections, both from the federal level and the state level. And, you know, the CARES Act included a lot of money to help with the COVID-related expenses that would be added onto elections, but most of us saw it as a down payment. And then there was private funding that was made available to help. And in Arizona, it helped tremendously with public education, ensuring that voters had access to the information and tools they needed to exercise their freedom to vote and do that safely. And now our legislature has tamped down on the ability for the use of private dollars to help fund elections. Certainly, we never rely on that as our first plan. But when elections are underfunded, we need resources to help voters vote. And now our hands are being tied there as well.
What is the sort of, is there a helpline or a hotline? I mean, is there a nationalized effort to capture all of these requests and all of these needs? And does it extend to security? I mean, do you hear from local election officials who feel targeted by hateful voicemails or people that don't trust them or like them? What is happening on the ground, Madam Secretary?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are continuing to see the increased threat environment as something that election officials are concerned about. But we're in constant communication with them about what their needs are. We coordinate on election security issues across the state to ensure that those resources are there and that if we can provide assistance from our office. But there is certainly heightened scrutiny and threat on election workers, and we're concerned about the impact that might have on recruitment for those temporary workers that we need through the election season.
I asked you this, I think, almost a year ago, whether you feel safe or whether you still face threats. And obviously, you've taken the whole experience and it's fueling your run for governor. So I'm curious if it just fortified you, if it's still part of the job, or if you feel like the audits, as bogus as they were, sort of added some credibility in some corners. Just take me inside what you confront as a candidate for governor there.
I mean, kind of all of the above, right? I mean, certainly I'm going to continue to do my job despite whatever threats or attacks come my way. My office continues to be under sort of a barrage of attacks through whatever avenues are available to people, through social media, through emails, voicemails, and we're soldiering on because that's the job that I was elected to do and oversee the office that does that. And we're going to continue. It is one of the most daunting things about being in politics right now is just the level of attacks and harassment that we're subjected to. But I'm going to keep doing my job, and I'm going to keep working to lead the state of Arizona.
Arizona Secretary of State Katie Hobbs and Kim Atkins-Storr, thank you both so much for spending some time with us today.
We continue to see not only these forces massed, we continue to see critical units moving toward the border, not away from the border. So what we need to see is exactly the opposite. We need to see these forces moving away. We've heard what the Kremlin said about this. As President Biden said yesterday, we'd welcome that, but we haven't seen it on the ground. And the bottom line is this: we're prepared either way. We're prepared to engage in diplomacy with Russia if it's serious about it. We're also prepared for renewed Russian aggression.
Hi again, everyone. It's 5 o'clock in the East. A dose of reality there this morning, despite Russian claims that some of its troops are being withdrawn from Ukraine's border. That is, in fact, not the case, at least not now. Secretary of State Antony Blinken was there on Morning Joe, echoing a statement made by the NATO Secretary General in Brussels earlier, where NATO defense ministers are meeting. And State Department spokesman Ned Price reiterated that this is exactly how Russia operates.
We know the Russian playbook. We know the Russians engage in misinformation and disinformation. We have good reason to believe the Russians are saying one thing and doing another in an effort to obfuscate, in an effort to hide the truth. The threat is very real, as you've heard from us for several days now. We are well within the window where Vladimir Putin, were he to choose to do so, could order an attack against Ukraine. That has not changed.
Now, despite deep concerns of a potentially imminent invasion, the U.S. and our allies remain hopeful that a diplomatic agreement can still be reached. Today, Ukraine held a Day of Unity, a holiday announced by Ukraine's president just days ago in response to recent intelligence that suggested a Russian invasion was likely to launch today. The New York Times is out with new analysis on the tactic we've seen employed by both sides in the conflict, a signaling of the high price of war in order to avert it. About that phenomenon, the Times writes this, quote, "Traditional diplomacy is just one component of this dance. Troop movements, sanctions warnings and legislation, embassy closures, leaders' summits, and intelligence leaks are all aimed, in part, at proving each country's willingness to carry out certain threats or accept certain risks. It is a form of high-stakes negotiation, conducted in actions as much as words, meant to settle the future of Europe just as conclusively as if decided by war, by telegraphing how a conflict would play out rather than waging it directly. This is not a conflict with just any autocrat." The Times also out with some new reporting on the obstacle Vladimir Putin poses to the U.S. intelligence community. Quote, "Knowing the intention of any autocratic leader is difficult, but Putin, who began his career as a KGB officer, is a particular challenge because he avoids electronic devices, oftentimes bans note takers, and tells his aides little. There's a limit to how much an intelligence agency can learn about his intentions and thinking." The Times adds this, quote, "Putin's calculus, according to a U.S. official, is likely shifting as he weighs the changing costs of an invasion and he assesses what he could get from negotiations. Several officials note that Putin has a history of waiting until the last possible moment to make a decision, constantly reevaluating his options. The still very real threat of Russia invading Ukraine is where we start this hour with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Michael Crowley is here. He's a diplomatic correspondent with the New York Times. Also joining us, Mark Jacobson, a combat veteran who served in Afghanistan in 2006. He also served in Kabul as the deputy NATO representative and was former senior advisor to Defense Secretary Ash Carter. And our friend Kimberly Atkins-Storr is back, Boston Globe senior columnist and an MSNBC political analyst. I want to read something to you, Mark Jacobson, that Tom Friedman writes today. "Is Sleepy Joe Biden making Vladimir Putin blink? Putin has been on such a run of outmaneuvering the West and destabilizing our politics that it is easy to overrate him. It's also hard to believe a word that comes out of his mouth. But if Putin was sincere when he said Tuesday that he was ready to continue on the negotiating track to ensure that Ukraine never joins NATO, and was also pulling back some of his menacing forces, U.S. officials say there's no sign of that yet. It is because Biden's statecraft has given Putin pause." What do you think of that?
Well, I think there's some good, some bad, and a little bit of uncertainty here, too. I mean, the good news is we've seen Ukrainian resolve, and that's really going to be key in terms of Putin's calculus. Although not as important as what I'm not quite sure is going well, and that's unity amongst the allies. I think we'll see as the Munich conference takes place over the next couple of days, it's going to be important to kind of see the public statements made by European and U.S. leadership. And here's the uncertain, and I think this is where Friedman has it right. Has the U.S. done anything that has given Putin pause? Is there something that we have done or something we've said in private or something that we've signaled quietly to Putin in terms of the sanctions and how we're going to hurt them that's made him take pause? I don't know the answer to that. That's certainly we're going to see in the next couple of days. But there's an argument to be made that Putin simply wanted to create a crisis in order to solve it. And that's going to make things much more difficult because then we can lose the battle of the negotiations as well.
Michael Crowley, I want to play something that you pointed to watching President Biden's address to the nation yesterday around this time. Let's play it. We'll talk about it on the other side.
I will not pretend this will be painless. There could be impact on our energy prices. So we are taking active steps to alleviate the pressure on our own energy markets and offset raising prices. We're coordinating with major energy consumers and producers. We're prepared to deploy all the tools and authority at our disposal to provide relief at the gas pump. And I'll work with Congress on additional measures to help protect consumers and address the impact of prices at the pump.
You drew our attention to that with your tweet saying that it's new, Biden's talk of a national sacrifice. He has been at these issues and dealing with some of these issues his entire career. And it was notable to hear him sort of offering that straight talk. I know some folks like Michael McFaul have been eager to hear him do this for a while now. He certainly laid it out yesterday.
That's right, Nicole. And that was really pretty much the only new thing I heard in those remarks. A lot of it was assembling things we had heard before, but it jumped out at me because I had just not heard that note from him, basically telling the American people to brace themselves for what may be to come. And, part of what that tells me is how seriously the administration takes this. There's a lot of gamesmanship going on. You quoted a great piece that Max Fisher at the New York Times wrote about how there's a lot of signaling and messaging and both sides trying to warn each other not to cross the line here. But I think that the fact that he's willing to say that suggests that President Biden thinks that this is very real. It's also a reminder that although we have a lot of economic power to try to punish Russia for any kind of military or politically destabilizing action it might take in Ukraine, we don't know what exactly the reverberations of that could be in the global economy. There will be unintended consequences. They're likely to hit Europe harder than us, but it's quite possible the global financial system will be shaken, energy markets will be shaken, and if the crisis escalates, it could get quite serious for average Americans.
And this idea of sacrifice and potential pain was something that surprisingly Mitch McConnell came out and endorsed. Let me show you that, Kim.
There was much in the president's remarks that I appreciated. He was right to candidly remind the Russian people that neither the United States nor NATO nor Ukraine want a war. He was right to emphasize that the world will not shrug or stand idly by if Vladimir Putin tries to invade his neighbor or redraw the map of Europe through deadly force. I'm hopeful that President Biden will rise to the occasion. As a bipartisan group of colleagues and I made clear in a joint statement yesterday, the president would have overwhelming bipartisan support to use his existing executive authorities for tough sanctions against Russia in the event of conflict.
So let's listen to Mitch McConnell. Isn't something I say very often in these 2 hours, as you know, Kim. But it is notable that, be it through the rapid analysis and dissemination of intelligence or through near daily briefings, and I imagine they go on at all hours with bipartisan leaders on the Hill, the president has not only, at this point, united the allies in a way that exceeds expectations from 4 weeks ago, but has managed to unite a very unwieldy and polarized and almost post-fact Republican minority, at least in the Senate. We shouldn't sort of throw a parade for anybody because that's how it's supposed to work, but it is notable in these times.
It is notable in this moment, and of course, members of the Senate are also working in a bipartisan way to try to pass a bill for additional sanctions that are aimed directly at this conflict, in addition to the powers that President Biden already has to impose sanctions. And perhaps this sort of unity is exactly what may be making Vladimir Putin rethink his calculus. Just think, the end point, what Vladimir Putin wants to do is to destabilize the West, destabilize Western nations, and increase his own influence in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. And it seems so far that what this threat to invade Ukraine has done is unify the West really solidly against him and leaving him very isolated, I guess, except for China. And that isn't what he wants. And this is part of what we're seeing here. So it's important. It's an area where there is strong bipartisanship. Now, make no mistake, I think if gas prices go up as a result of all of this, there will be Republicans trying to point the finger at Biden in a political way. But in this point right now, it is an important bipartisan unity that is being displayed that is really important as we face this crisis.
And Mark, we highlight it because, as Kim said, it may very well turn out to be fleeting. But it just makes me want to ask your thoughts on whether or not Vladimir Putin miscalculated.
I'm not sure he miscalculated if, again, you look at his broader foreign policy objectives. Keep the U.S. out of European affairs, keep weakening the United States by attacking us internally, and then slice off a piece of the Ukraine here and there. I mean, what I see is a potential opportunity for him to play off the old Minsk agreement and try and sow some disunity between the Europeans and the Ukrainians and the United States and say, well, let's sit down at the table. This is unsettled. Let's spend some time settling it. And he could very well end up with an agreement that favors Russia, hurts Ukraine, but preserves the peace. And I think even though there's political unity in the U.S., the longer this goes on, the more that Putin tries to find ways to breach any sort of unity, I think that there's a risk that he could get what he wants without war.
Michael Crowley, take us inside what look like sort of feverish preparations for, as Mark is suggesting, at this point, any outcome, any choice Putin makes. He still is the wild card here in everyone's analysis.
Well, that's right, Nicole. It's interesting to me that Biden White House has been open about the amount of planning it's doing. They have these, I think they call it a tiger team, that has been running scenarios of how they would respond to different actions Vladimir Putin would take. They've been happy to talk about that with the media. And, here I see a little bit of a correction from how things happened with Afghanistan, where at least there was the perception that there had not been adequate planning. They had not anticipated all the things that could go wrong and how quickly. And I think, among other things, in this case, they are determined to be ready for pretty much anything. So that's good news. Their eyes on the ball. They are looking at, anything that Putin could possibly do. The problem is, Vladimir Putin really does have a way of surprising the United States. And I think there's a sort of a reasonable paranoia about what he's capable of, because in 2014, in Crimea and in Donbass, U.S. officials and U.S. intelligence really underestimated how far he was willing to go. Similarly, when he intervened in Syria, the U.S. really didn't see that coming. So the Biden White House is trying to show us that they are ready for anything. At the same time, I think they're worried, what is it that we might be missing?
Yeah, Kim, Ambassador McFall and others make the point on this show every time they're here that nobody knows what Putin's going to do, not even necessarily Putin, before he does it. And so we've spent I take Michael Crowley's point that the planning is meant to showcase what I think folks around Biden believe is one of his strong assets, these decades of experience on foreign policy matters, his decades-long relationships with some of the other leaders on the world stage. But the unpredictability of Vladimir Putin does always leave everyone reacting and responding to Vladimir Putin. That's true. And there are additional threats against the U.S. and other Western allies that we haven't even talked about yet. The threat of cyber attacks that can happen whether or not there is an invasion in Ukraine, so long as these tensions are high. There are the rising gas prices. There are other things that Putin can continue to do against Ukraine and elsewhere. This is one reason why those ongoing discussions about additional sanctions that are taking place in the Senate are so important, and you need to address all those things. But he is unpredictable. And
that is what makes this crisis high. We are right that he could still be trying to plan ways to get what he wants out of this and emerge as a victory. So it's a really critical point. It is delicate, but the unity, at least that we see so far, is important. It would be even better if Congress could act in a bipartisan way to pass an additional package so that there's another arrow in the president's quiver.
To put some teeth in those threats. Michael Crowley, Mark Jacobson, thank you both so much for starting us off today. Kim Atkins Storr sticks around when we come back.